Power rarely collapses when it first becomes difficult to manage. More often, it begins to decline while still appearing successful. Territories remain under control, taxes continue to arrive, armies remain deployed, official maps still display familiar borders. The authority sees obedience and mistakes it for stability. The danger emerges when control becomes evidence that everything is working. Expansion continues, institutions endure, resistance remains limited. Yet beneath the appearance of order, legitimacy begins to weaken. Authority becomes increasingly dependent on maintaining what it already possesses, rather than understanding what has changed. Few empires illustrate this process more clearly than the Spanish Empire during the 17th century. For generations, it had accumulated territory, wealth, and influence across Europe and the Americas. It governed one of the largest imperial systems the world had ever seen. Yet the very mechanisms that once demonstrated its strength gradually obscured the pressures that would erode its authority. By the beginning of the 17th century, the Spanish monarchy governed an empire stretching across multiple continents. Under the Habsburg rulers, authority extended from the Iberian Peninsula to territories in Italy, the Low Countries, the Americas, and parts of Asia. Silver from the mines of the New World flowed through imperial institutions. Military forces defended extensive possessions. Royal councils administered a vast collection of provinces, connected through dynastic authority and imperial administration. The empire appeared stable. Its rulers possessed prestige unmatched by most European rivals. Its armies remained feared. Its colonial network generated immense wealth. Royal authority projected continuity through ceremonies, decrees, and bureaucratic structures that linked distant territories to Madrid. The institutions of power reflected confidence rather than uncertainty. Expansion had created an empire capable of commanding resources on a global scale. The governing assumption was that authority would continue operating as it always had. The structures that had produced strength appeared sufficient to preserve it. Yet expansion had created obligations as well as advantages. The empire's territories required defense across enormous distances. Armies had to be supplied. Naval routes had to be protected. Administrative systems had to coordinate regions separated by oceans. Every new possession increased the burden placed upon authority. At first, these pressures appeared manageable. Silver shipments helped finance military commitments. Borrowing provided additional flexibility. Victories reinforced confidence among ruling elites. Success seemed to confirm the effectiveness of existing institutions. But authority began interpreting endurance as proof of stability. Military campaigns continued because previous campaigns had continued. Financial obligations expanded because earlier obligations had been sustained. The empire remained powerful enough to absorb strain, and that ability encouraged further commitments. Provincial officials collected taxes according to expectations established during more prosperous decades, even as local conditions became increasingly difficult to sustain. The pressure accumulated slowly. Imperial revenues rose and fell unpredictably. Inflation distorted economic relationships throughout the empire. Debt expanded. Yet the monarchy continued operating as though temporary adjustments would be sufficient. When resources became constrained, authority rarely reduced commitments. Instead, it searched for additional means of maintaining them. Borrowing increased. Financial restructuring became recurrent. Existing obligations remained largely untouched because withdrawing from them risked signaling weakness. The appearance of control became increasingly valuable. From Madrid, the empire still looked coherent. Orders continued moving through administrative channels. Armies remained active. Officials continued reporting loyalty. The structures of authority remained visible. Yet visibility and stability were no longer the same thing. As the 17th century progressed, rivals adapted to changing conditions more effectively than Spain. New commercial networks emerged. Alternative centers of power expanded. Warfare became increasingly expensive. The empire faced challenges that required flexibility. Flexibility, however, had become difficult. Authority had invested legitimacy in the continuation of existing arrangements. Policies that once reinforced imperial strength became politically difficult to reconsider. Institutions optimized for preservation became less capable of adaptation. Merchants adjusted to disruptions in trade routes, while imperial regulations continued reflecting conditions that no longer existed. The distance between authority and reality widened gradually. Information still reached governing institutions, but responses often reflected inherited assumptions. Problems were addressed through mechanisms designed for an earlier phase of imperial power. Expansion had produced administrative habits that now constrained decision-making. The monarchy remained committed to maintaining its position across Europe. Military obligations persisted despite mounting costs. Financial pressures intensified despite repeated efforts to stabilize them. Each response attempted to preserve authority. Each response also increased dependence on structures that were becoming harder to sustain. Control remained visible. But legitimacy increasingly depended upon performances of strength that required resources authority no longer possessed in abundance. The empire's reach itself became part of the burden. Territories acquired through generations of expansion demanded attention, defense, and administration. What had once demonstrated power now consumed it. In distant provinces, imperial representatives continued enforcing royal authority, while local populations encountered growing evidence that the empire's capacity was becoming uneven. The erosion did not occur through a single failure. It emerged through repetition. Financial crises returned. Military pressures persisted. Administrative reforms remained partial. Authority responded repeatedly, but increasingly within limits created by its own earlier decisions. Each attempt to preserve coherence reduced flexibility further. The institutions remained operational. The monarchy remained legitimate in formal terms. The empire still commanded respect, yet authority was becoming less capable of translating control into durable stability. The distinction mattered. Control measures obedience at a particular moment. Stability requires confidence that authority can continue responding effectively as conditions change. The Spanish monarchy retained the first long after it began losing the second. By the latter half of the 17th century, the consequences became harder to conceal. Economic weaknesses persisted. Military setbacks accumulated. Rival powers expanded their influence. Administrative reforms arrived, but they addressed pressures that had been developing for decades. Authority continued functioning. Yet increasing portions of the empire depended upon momentum rather than renewal. Officials still administered territories. Taxes were still collected. Decrees were still issued. The machinery of empire remained visible even as confidence in its future weakened. The fracture emerged not through sudden destruction, but through diminishing credibility. The monarchy could still command obedience, but it struggled to convince subjects, rivals, and institutions that its authority retained the same capacity it once possessed. Adaptation arrived after flexibility had already narrowed. Responses emerged after conditions had already changed. Control survived. The belief that control guaranteed stability did not. By the time the empire's leadership recognized the scale of the transformation, many of the assumptions sustaining imperial authority had already become difficult to restore. The institutions remained. The monarchy remained. Yet the coherence that had connected expansion, legitimacy, and authority had begun to unravel. What endured was an empire increasingly shaped by the consequences of decisions made during its own period of greatest confidence. Power rarely disappears all at once. More often, it survives long enough to discover that authority and legitimacy are not the same thing. Explore more stories about power, legitimacy, and historical consequence on timeless questions. At what point do you think legitimacy becomes impossible to restore?